While filming our $350 budget build, we were pretty impressed at the value that the new Lancer G2 line brings. It was a tough call, but in the end, the Lancer G2 just offers the perfect fit for someone just looking to get into the sport on a budget. Now, the fact remains that there are many players dead set on a metal body. Not only is a metal body more realistic, but there's no dreaded body creak, and a metal base is always just going to be that much more consistent than a polymer base. Well, Lancer is now offering that same G2 M4, this time with a full metal body, and it comes with a MOSFET unit. For those who don't know, a MOSFET unit is essentially an electronic trigger instead of a physical switch. It offers a lighter, faster response, and it allows you to run more powerful 11-1 batteries. But this all bumps up the price to a mid-tier level, and competition is steep. When I reviewed ENC's M4s, I said they were easily one of the best mid-tier AEGs out there, with excellent quality control and a rock-solid build. So let's see how Lancer's G2 PROLINE stacks up. I chose this model, specifically the LT02T G2ME, to go head-to-head with ENC's 302. Now, the Lancer is also available in a longer LT03, but I figured the shorter CQB length along with that front rail might be a little bit more popular. It's also available in a black color, but I chose the tan one as it's a little easier to compare. We begin with packaging. The Lancer box comes with graphics that seem more fitting for some extreme sports equipment from Canadian Tire. I get the look that they were going for, but I wouldn't be caught lugging around this box. Inside, the gun is housed in molded cardboard protection. It's adequate, but there's also no protection for the left side of the gun. You get the standard cleaning rod, packet of .2 BBs, some Lancer stickers / patch, and an instruction manual. The manual is actually pretty decent, and it's not a bad idea to go through it if it is your first gun. Surprise, surprise, this gun actually comes with a mid-cap, which is interesting to see. It's worth noting that if you don't have a speed loader, you'll need one to load this magazine. This model also does include a vertical grip in the box. Onto the ENC. Take in all the beautiful graphics this box doesn't have. Inside, you get water jet cut foam, which is nice to see as it's the same stuff you'll find for guns costing twice as much. The gun is well protected on all sides, and I'd have no problems using this box until I get a gun case. You get the standard issue metal high cap and an instruction leaflet that looks fresh from the 90s. In its defense, there was a surprising lack of English, and it does get the basics across. And that is all the gun comes with. On one hand, it's easy to look at the empty slots and think you just got ripped off, but on the other hand, at least you're not paying for accessories you won't use. I think that's what I actually like about ENC. It's a very no-frills approach that only focuses on what matters, the gun itself. So let's take a look at the guns, starting with the Lancer. It certainly delivers on the promise of metal. Almost everything you'd expect to be metal is indeed metal, and the gun without mag or battery comes in at 2.67 kilograms, which is right about average for a metal body M4. A real M4 is right around 3 kilograms empty. This model is for the US market, so you do have a plastic orange tip. It's pinned into place and it can be removed, but it might be a little easier just to paint it. Build quality wise, it feels definitely a step up from the plastic version, all except the handguard. There is a ridiculous amount of play and it makes the front end feel really cheap. Otherwise, like I said, nothing to complain. There's no play in the receiver, buffer tube, or barrel. The crane stock has a little bit of movement laterally as well as forward to back, but it's still better than most crane stocks we've seen. The selector switch is very smooth and notches into place well, but almost takes too little effort, and I'd worry it might pop out of position during a game. Charging handle feels like most other AEG M4s, that is pretty disappointing with a hollow sound to it. There's no bolt catch, so you'll have to hold it open while adjusting hop-up. The polymer flip-up rear sight is a nice little unit with a solid build and very nice clicky notches. The ENC weighs in at 2.74 kilograms, which is just a touch heavier. The gun is a solid build on all fronts, including the rail, which has next to no movement. The crane stock has right about the same amount of movement as the Lancer. The selector switch is a little less smooth than the Lancer, but notches into place a little better, and I don't feel like it would come out of position like the Lancer switch. The charging handle is one of the better AEG ones we've seen, with a decent tension and sound to it. There is a bolt catch on this one for adjusting hop-up. The rear sight is the rear half of a standard M4 sight. Nice notches to it, but there is a little bit of play which is not nice to see on a sight. Overall, the build quality is one of the reasons I like ENC so much. It really is every bit as solid as higher end guns. It's not that the Lancer is bad, but head to head, ENC's build quality sets a high standard for mid-tier guns. Looking at the finish on the guns, the Lancer has a nice tan color that's all the same shade for the metal parts, but is a slightly different shade on the polymer parts. The finish is on the matte side with a uniform texture on the body. It doesn't have that metallic look that we've been seeing a lot of, but rather physically is a little bumpy. It seems like a durable finish, but it does show scuff marks pretty easily. I'm not a fan of the ejection port finish though, and it looks somewhat cheap and has kind of a pot metal finish. The selector and rail markings are engraved, and the Lancer trades are laser etched. I like how it says designed in California, which reminds me of a certain fruit named company. Looking at the ENC, it's a slightly less matte finish, but by no means is it glossy. It's a smoother feel to the touch and I think a bit more realistic. It also feels like a thinner paint, which makes the edges a little more crisp, but in our experience doesn't scratch too easily. The barrel and buffer tube have a slightly different hue to it, which actually makes a nice subtle contrast. Otherwise, the paint is the same throughout the metal parts. The selector and rail markings are laser etched, and the gun lacks any trades whatsoever. It looks a little blank, but again, this can be a good thing for custom trades. It's a small difference between the two, but the finish on the ENC is just a leg above the Lancer's. As far as ergonomics go, the Lancer has a couple added features out of the box. It comes with rail covers and a vertical grip, which are often first upgrades, so it's pretty nice to have that as an option to see if you like it. They swapped out the standard pistol grip for a 416 style grip, added an enlarged trigger guard, and it comes with a flat trigger. It's a personal preference which is more comfortable, but the Lancer will have the more updated look. They both come with the same metal sling mounts, and both come with the same crane stock, though the Lancer has a softer, more comfortable butt pad. Both rifles have a quick change spring, so you can drop the FPS without taking apart the mech box. For anyone looking for a first AEG, a quick change spring should be a priority. On the Lancer, you unscrew the buffer tube screw and slide off the buffer tube. Notice that the receiver piece that the buffer tube slips over is relatively short, which worries me a little for durability. Simply insert an Allen key, push in and turn, and the spring slides right out. We've seen this design on a few different guns, and it's a reliable design. Let's see how ENC handles it. Unscrew the buffer tube screw and slide off that buffer tube. Not only is the piece on the receiver a little longer than the Lancer's, the buffer screw actually locks into this metal bolt. Underneath the bolt, you'll find the spring guide itself, which comes out much the same way, this time with a flat head. No one else does a quick change spring like ENC, and I think the solid metal bolt is a great idea for added strength. Looking at the spring guide side to side, you'll notice the ENC has 4 prongs instead of the standard 2. They both have ball bearings, but the Lancer's is half polymer while the ENC is full metal. Diving into the internals, I noticed the Lancer has classic style body pins, while the ENC has pins that are captured by Allen screws. The Lancer uses a newer style hop-up with large adjustment wheel. It's mated to a 260mm 6.03 brass barrel. The ENC uses the older style M4 hop-up, but it is a metal unit. It's mated to a slightly longer 289mm 6.05 brass barrel. We'll see which design works better in our shooting test. Splitting open the Lancer mech box, the first thing I notice is 2 wires are already fraying. One looked like it was nicked by the motor pinion, and the other was sandwiched between the mech box shells. This could lead to no electrical response in the future, and it isn't good to see on a brand new gun. There's a small amount of grease, but it is in key areas. The steel 18:1 ratio gears is a popular gear ratio, and they all ride on ball bearings. The sector gear has a delayer, which basically keeps the chamber open a little longer and prevents misfeeds on higher rate of fire builds. A small detail that's nice to see. Other parts are pretty standard for a mid-tier AEG with plastic nozzle, plastic cylinder head, and plastic piston, but I'm glad to see full metal piston teeth. Looking at the ENC, it's worth noting that the mech box uses T9 Torx screws. Screwdrivers might be a little harder to find, but any hardware store should have them. Compared to Phillips, I think it's the better screw that doesn't strip as easily. Opening up the mech box, there is even less grease than on the Lancer, and the gears are almost dry, which is a little concerning. Though I am glad to see none of the wires are frayed. The steel gears are also 18:1 ratio and also ride on ball bearings. Other parts are, again, pretty standard for a mid-tier AEG with plastic nozzle, plastic cylinder head, and plastic piston. But like the Lancer, also has full metal piston teeth. Here we can see the standard trigger versus Lancer's MOSFET trigger. An electronic trigger will always be a little faster than a standard one, and the big advantage is an 11-1 battery won't cause arcing or corrode a MOSFET trigger. So let's take a look at those trigger pulls. I'm using a 7.4 LiPo for both. Starting with the traditional contacts on the ENC, there's about 1mm of dead travel until tension ramps up. There's 3mm of tension until you hit the brake. It's not really a clean brake at all, and it's tough to anticipate when the gun will shoot. Right after the brake, tension drops and the trigger jumps back with 1mm of over travel. Reset is right where the tension begins, and for an AEG has a pretty decent click to it. Overall, travel is pretty long and heavy, and the brake is vague, but it's on par with other AEG triggers. On to the Lancer MOSFET trigger. The pull begins very smooth and light, and I expected a ramp up in stiffness, but it never came. Instead, the trigger breaks after 2mm of travel, and there is another 1mm of over travel after the break. There is no warning before the break. The reset has no feedback whatsoever, and it's hard to tell when you can shoot again, but it's a short pull, so might as well release the trigger entirely. Overall, if you're looking for a mouse click speed trigger, the Lancer is actually a solid trigger. It's very fast and responsive. But if you seek a more realistic trigger with a good reset, the ENC would be your best bet. Let's bring these guns onto the range and see how they actually shoot. Chrono test is up first. We're using 0.2 gram BBs with both hop-ups set to the middle setting. The ENC shows pretty good consistency with most shots being within 2 FPS and deviation between the lowest and highest FPS just under 4. Rate of fire with a 7.4 is very average at 12.1 rounds per second. The Lancer is pretty consistent but trails slightly behind the ENC with most shots within a 4 FPS spread with a deviation between the lowest and highest at 6 FPS. Rate of fire with the same 7.4 is bumped up to 14.2 seconds. With an 11 1-volt battery, rate of fire is bumped up significantly to 23 rounds per second. For an accuracy test, this time I slapped on a bipod and a big ol' scope and fired 10 shots at a paper target. I know it's not the longest range, but it'll still tell us something. ENC is up first with its 6.05mm barrel. Remember, we're not looking at how close it is to the center, but rather the grouping. Not bad with a 2.5cm grouping. If it weren't for the flyer on the left, it'd be closer to a 2cm grouping. The Lancer is up next with another 10 shots fired with the crosshair right on the center dot. Wow, that is definitely an improvement. Remember, the Lancer has a 6.03mm barrel, and it does seem to make a difference. All shots land within 2 centimeters, and most shots are within 1.5. Here you can see both targets side by side. It looks like 6.03 is the way to go. So overall, how do they compare in terms of shooting feel? Make no mistake, they're both good AEGs, but I think it really boils down to preference. The ENC feels just a little bit more solid in the hands, and it has that clicky reset, which I really like. However, if you're trying to get the most rounds down range, the sluggish trigger will definitely let you down. The Lancer has that flat trigger, which I tend to prefer, and it just feels a little bit snappier. The gun barely moves as you shoot it, and it's really easy to get accurate shots downrange. If you need to suppress a target, even in semi-auto, you can get a lot of shots off with a quick finger. Add an 11-1 battery, and this thing really rips. So, which one do I think you should spend your hard-earned loonies and toonies on? Throughout the whole video, I felt myself leaning towards the ENC. It's just the better replica. And for someone looking for a really nice solid M4, it's tough to beat. However, I do understand the allure of the faster MOSFET trigger. For someone looking at gaming a lot, it's just tough to compete against guys with high rate of fire builds without that MOSFET unit. Back a couple years ago, a full MOSFET build was somewhere around $600 to $700. Now you can get 23 rounds per second at half that price. No, obviously you're not going to have the same bulletproof internals, but honestly, this Lancer trigger is pretty good. So at the end of the day, you got to ask yourself which is more important to you, and try to come into the store and shoot them for yourself. Who knows, it might change your mind. As always, thanks for watching, subscribe for regular updates, and we'll catch you on the next one.